tell you a little bit about Chad for those of you that don't know him well. He came back to his alma mater here in 2014 after having been gone for about 11 years. He graduated in 2003 with a social sciences composite major and a minor in physical education and secondary education. So that's kind of a mouthful. I got that from your CV. He went on to get a master's at Western Michigan and then a PhD in the history and philosophy of sport from Penn State. As part of this Continuum Scholars Workshop, we each wrote, and I say we because even the facilitators had an opportunity to do this, we each wrote kind of a less traditional bio that described a little bit about our professional journeys, but put in there some about our vocational calling. So I just want to read you a few lines from Chad's bio. It says, and I'm quoting, "My undergraduate days at Hope helped me to accept that I was very much like many of my relatives, interested in teaching. My graduate days at Penn State helped me realize two additional things. First, that I could actually study my interests, which are play, games, and sports, through the lens of history and philosophy. And second, that I could do all of this as a Christian. But I never thought, in fact, I would be a professor. I never cared that much about school. I never thought I had what it takes. And my past self always makes fun of my current self when those two have a conversation." End quote. So Chad has coached many different kinds of teams in a variety of sports, and he is currently the men's assistant basketball coach. He teaches a wide variety of courses. He has worked with undergraduates on topics ranging from bullfighting to the NCAA March Madness. And yes, Chad, I would say that your past self may laugh at your current self, but those of us fortunate enough to know you are so glad that you answered God's call to come back here and do your work with us. So thanks for being part of today's session. Chad knows that I have to duck out to another meeting. I did meet with him, so I heard all this great stuff already. So Jonathan, my colleague Jonathan Haygood, is going to facilitate the Q&A. Chad has to teach at noon, so your questions will have to be, sort of laser focused. But thank you very much, Chad, and I hope it goes well.
Thanks, Karen. Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks, Andy, for this program. For my inclusion in it, I had a wonderful experience there. I think I went into Continuum program a little bit skeptical, as I am with a lot of discussion-based stuff, and maybe they were skeptical of me, but it was a wonderful experience, so much so that when I filled out my service to Hope Forum last month, I listed that as one of the most important things I thought I did throughout the year for a number of different reasons. So anyways, with a little help from our friends, how we can all benefit from Kinesiology's Dismissal of Dualism. Here's a quote I want to start with. "Whenever I feel the urge to exercise, I lie down until my clothes are clean." When I first heard this quote, I thought, there's no way that some people actually think that. I use that to start some of my health diet classes at the beginning of the semester, and I see students nodding. There are people that actually think that I need to be able to relate to. I did some further look into who actually said this. This is one of those quotes that a lot of people have said. It's been attributed to a lot of different people. So I have two pictures there. The people that have reportedly said it. The top is Mark Twain, who apparently said it at his 70th birthday party, and then went on to say the only exercise I've ever gotten in my life is eating and sleeping. So, a very smart person. Had no value, therefore, for physical activity. The second one is Robert Maynard Hutchins, who was a former president of the University of Chicago. The reason why I'm familiar with him is that he was president of the University of Chicago at a time at which they made some changes, especially in their intercollegiate athletics program. They were originally a Big Ten school, a founding member of the Big Ten, founding member of the NCAA, and then in 1939, Hutchins decided that he was going to abolish football on campus because it had been too much of a distraction, and he downgraded the rest of the athletics program. Clearly someone who was interested more in the life of the mind than the life of the body. Which is what I want to talk about today, taking a look at dualism specifically in the academy when we separate mind and body, taking a look at kinesiology's roots, and how we've in some sense perpetuated the dualism that we're trying to overcome. The current status of things, especially at Hope College or general education requirements, how that looks in a non-dualistic mindset, and then using kinesiology's model to help us get beyond that to better understand why we're doing what we're doing, and why we're doing such a nice job. Taking a look at dualism, I want to be specific in what I'm talking about. This is a substance dualism. It's Cartesian dualism, that there are some things that are mind, those things are thinking, they don't have extension, we can't touch them, we can't feel them. That's mind, and on the other side is body, those things that have extension in space, that have no thought attached to them. Mind and body dualism. I think with that comes a number of characteristics, most of the time, not the least of which has to do with value. We have two seemingly opposable things, or things that are different. We have two options. We tend to prioritize one or the other. In the academy, that's oftentimes the mind. Behavior dualism follows that if we believe that the mind is more important maybe than the body, or the mind thinks and directs the body, our behavior follows. Or we believe that our behavior follows in that way, almost like the mind is the captain of a ship, or the pilot of the plane, and it directs the body, tells the body what to do. There's a knowledge dualism, I believe, in which we're taking a look at sort of an understanding or a mental understanding of something, as opposed to a practical knowledge of how to do something. So this morning when my snowblower doesn't start, I understand that there's a problem with the carburetor, yet I don't have an idea how to be able to fix it. And then language dualism, that we seem to think, or there seems to be, if we're thinking dualistically, an understanding that using language through words, through spoken words and written words tend to be better ways of displaying language, and therefore displaying intelligence than maybe other creative alternative methods, for instance, using our bodies. So that's the basis of the dualism I'm talking about. A few roots that might help, at least help me to better understand maybe some of how we've gotten to where we are, or how this dualistic mindset tends to play itself out even today. Looking at Plato, the dualism inherent in his education. Now Plato is actually someone that kinesiologists often look to and say this is a good example for us, because Plato valued the education of the body. There was the time spent educating the mind through discussions, through dialogue, through thinking. And then there was the education that went on in the gymnasium. This was actually training, but it was education. This was sort of a dualistic model. Spend some time in the gymnasium, spend some time with teachers and students in a classroom-like setting, or at least taking walks and having discussions. Both of those are important to him, but they were separate. And I think that Christianity actually plays a role in some of the dualistic tendencies that we've had more recently in terms of our thought. Paul's writing, in Paul's writing, he mentions a lot about sort of the flesh as opposed to the spirit. Now this isn't the exact same as mind-body dualism, but it takes a look at two sort of opposable pairs, that which is corporeal, that which is incorporeal. There's differences. So I wanted to read a few verses to you. Galatians 5:17, the flesh desires what is contrary to the spirit, and the spirit what is contrary to the flesh. They are in conflict with each other. Romans 8 verse 5, those who live according to the flesh have their mind set on what the flesh desires. Those who live in accordance with the spirit have their mind set on what the spirit desires. With the underlying assumption that there is a value difference, that what the spirit desires is what we should be desiring, what we should want. Galatians 5:19, the acts of the flesh are obvious: sexual immorality, impurity, and debauchery. In Romans 8 verse 3, what the law was unable to do because it was weakened by the flesh, God did by sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh to be the sin offering. And so he condemned sin in the flesh. Now again, this is a little bit different than mind-body dualism, but I think that the underlying idea is that we are sort of shackled, or we're imprisoned by our bodies. The fact that we have bodies means that we are sinful by nature. And once we die, we are unshackled, or we are released from the prison of our bodies up to be in communion with our Lord and Savior. Seeing the world in pairs is sort of a natural thing. At least that's what Carlson and Engstrom have argued as they describe more than 2,300 pairs, opposable pairs of human thought and language. They say that this was sort of a foundation for some of our intelligence. Anthropologically, if we look back at our ancestors thousands of years ago, those who did well and dealing with opposable pairs survived. Therefore, that type of intelligence perpetuated through the gene pools. If you are confronted by a wild animal, can I outrun that animal? Can I not outrun that animal? Can I kill this? Will it kill me? Can I eat that berry? Can I not? Can I swim across the river? Can I not? These opposable pairs that were very survivalistic showed an intelligence that sort of perpetuated throughout the years. We continue to use that even now today with kids, especially my kids, 4 and 6 years old. We're trying to teach them the difference between right and wrong. Was that a good decision, or was that a bad decision? So some of these dualities are very helpful for us and help us to navigate the world. Carlson and Engstrom want to say, if that's sort of the basis for our knowledge, especially as mature adults, then we probably haven't gotten far enough. We should instead see the way in which the world actually presents itself to us more often than not. And that is in terms of gradations between maybe one end or another, as opposed to just two options. there may be an unlimited number of options in a lot of the experiences that we have. Nevertheless, our thinking about the person is made up of a mind and body oftentimes sits with us. This is the most simplest way probably to understand what a person is. So we continue to think that way. We speak in these terms. The mind is a terrible thing to waste. She has a mind of her own, we say about people who are strong-willed and sometimes stubborn. What were you thinking? This is a question I get when people do dumb things or make mistakes. What were you thinking? Penny for your thoughts. We see someone with bad body language. We know there's something wrong, but we ask, what are your thoughts? Mind over manners, or mind over matter, mind your manners. And the mental work, that which involves decision-making and thinking, is white-collar work or prestigious work. The body, on the other hand, we have passions of the body, those things that may feel good, but we know they're not inherently pure. Sins of the flesh, dumb jocks, that is people who focus on training their bodies, are therefore not intelligent. Athleticism as raw and primal, that is those who can do amazing things with their bodies, that there's no intelligence connected to that. The death of the body, manual labor, and body work, that which maybe doesn't involve decision-making or not as much thought, it's more with the hands, more work, blue collar, not quite as prestigious. These are common pairs. This is a common pair that we oftentimes use when we think in these terms, I would say. And one of the founding fellows of the National Academy of Kinesiology and Higher Education, a guy named Scott Kretschmar, has come up with a tournament of dualism to show that if we are thinking in terms of mind-body dualism in higher education and education overall, this is how it plays out, especially for us in kinesiology. And this shows how we suffer from dualistic thinking. It shows how we might see ourselves as second-class citizens in the academy if we're going to look at things dualistically. And so he sets up a series of games. This is just sort of a thought project. So he sets up these games where we pit things against each other, mind against body, and see who wins out, and then see where we fall in terms of kinesiology. So stick with me here for a second. The first game, he wants to pit those classes or those majors or those disciplines that focus on theory. That is mind knowledge, this understanding of or about certain things. Theory versus skill, right? Skill is the body, theory would be the mind. We value, at the university, we value the mind stuff first and foremost. This is what we've done historically, especially with a dualistic type of thinking. That the understanding is the hallmark of education, right? That it's the life of the mind, that's what matters. So that those folks are out of the tournament, they win, they get all the prestige, all the status from not having to play anymore in this tournament. Then we split up the skills group into academic skills versus non-academic skills. So we have certain classes on our campus especially where we're working on academic skills. Writing classes, research methods or skills classes specifically, where although we're not dealing with theory, we're dealing with skills that will help us with intellectual or academic pursuits. And then there's non-academic skills. Well, one would be maybe more closely aligned with the mind, one with the body. So then we're going to allow the academic skill people out. They don't have to play anymore. They take the prestige and status from not having to play anymore. Academic skills then splits up into two groups. This is the third game now. Utility versus serendipity. We don't have a lot of that on campus. Utility being things like, vo-tech, but I think we have some classes that maybe are not academic skill classes, but are still helpful or useful for us to live good and easier lives. And so there's some of that if you're not academic based, at least be useful or helpful. So we have that group, and then we have the serendipity group, those that maybe don't add things directly into our lives, but still allow us to have some pleasure and help us to live, sort of a good life. The utility people there matter more, maybe potentially if we think about things dualistically. They're out of the tournament, and we have the serendipity group that splits up into a final game. When we have serendipity, these are the things that are just pleasurable skills that allow us to live the good life. And Kretschmar suggests that we split those up in between high culture and low culture. High culture being things like arts, music, theater, dance, those types of things. Low culture being things associated with recess. That happens to be movement, that happens to be physical activity, which happens to be kinesiology, right? So looking at this tournament, or looking at things this way, this dualistic mindset, if that's sort of the way in which we're thinking about things, kinesiology loses out. Now this is a bit of a caricaturization, right? So it might not be exactly the way we think, or we might not have many people on campus who would say, yeah, I believe that, I think that way. That's clearly the hierarchy. However, I think that there's still sort of a specter of some of that. And I see it when I'm advising students. when someone has a really full load and they're only at 14 credits, what are they going to add for 2, just to sort of be able to have fun, be able to have fun, because it's not really hard work. Right? We're adding health diet, we're adding an FA2 class, right? Those things that have to do with sort of the skill stuff. But really, that last game, sort of, we're all losers at that point in time. We're thinking dualistically. I think our colleagues in dance, art, theater, and music might agree with that. So this is a way of thinking about how things play out if we're using a dualistic mindset, how kinesiology suffers. Unfortunately, the history of kinesiology is such that we've, in some sense, brought this on ourselves. If this is what we're doing in kinesiology or physical education, we're opening ourselves up for criticism, this type of thing. It's just fun, it's just playing games, there's not real academic work going on. Kinesiology departments started as largely as departments of physical culture, departments of hygiene, departments of physical activity. Those were the names that sort of evolved into, especially after World War II, mostly departments of physical education. After that World War, especially getting into the Cold War, we wanted to make sure that we had an physically educated population that was ready to fight, that was ready to outdo the Soviets, right? That was important to us. And really the last couple of decades, we've come into taking on the term kinesiology. Right now, we're an ology now, which means that we do real work, right? Real scientific work. We're just like the sciences. Cynics would say that that's certainly the case. But we're dealing with more than just being physically active. In fact, in our kinesiology department, most of our classes deal with theory. There are some that are skills-based, but we have a lot that are dealing with the theory of the human body, the theories of movement, that type of thing. And yet, physical activity still sits with us. If we're going to look at the academy dualistically, where is the body? It's with kinesiology. Kinesiologists have used a number of different models or logos to describe what they do in attempts to overcome the dualistic mindset. I want to talk quickly about some of these early attempts and how they still fall short. A sound mind and a sound body. We often point to that and say, see, bodies still matter. If we're going to say a sound mind and a sound body is good, sound body is still a part of that. But dualistically, we're still looking at a sound mind as a thing being inside a sound body, which is dualistic, which hurts us at the end of the day. A unity of mind, body, and spirit, a former YMCA slogan. The YMCA is saying that they are able to unify the mind, body, and spirit as if they were not already unified. Education through the physical, 1965. Education of the physical, 1966. These are also ways in which we tried to overcome that by saying, look how important the education of the body or education through the body is, which is true. But there's still implicit in those statements the thinking that there is a greater good. An education of the mind would be superior, and we can obtain that through physical education. Scott Kretschmar wants to argue that a more accurate picture, though, if we look at things non-dualistically, a more accurate picture will show that physical influences are always shaping all that we are and do. That a more accurate picture will show that the influences of consciousness are always at work. A more accurate picture will show that bodies and minds are not independent from one another. When you're dealing with me, you are never dealing with just my mind or just my thoughts. They are always my thoughts that have been influenced by my vehicle under the world, my body. Further, you're never dealing with just my body. My body is always connected to my consciousness, to my experiences, to how I've lived. So important in health professions and working with patients and students. We'll depict different levels of behavioral intelligence, and we'll depict different types of activity. And that's where I want to go from here, to take a look at maybe understanding a mindset of intelligence, an understanding of intelligence. The mindset language is here. Understanding a reconceptualization of intelligence that might be more favorable to kinesiology and to all of us, I think, in the long run. The yellow arrows would indicate sort of a dualistic understanding of intelligence, that the mind, or those things in which we're thinking, those behaviors in which we're thinking, are superior because they involve or include thinking. In the academy, this would be maybe the mindset. And yet, down at the bottom then, would be the body, or those things in which we are doing. We are say, being active. Those are inferior because thinking is not involved. That's a dualistic mindset. I want to go down to the white arrows and say, yes, we do have a difference in the character of the behaviors that we do. Right? Some things that we do are much more sedentary, would involve, say, more thinking. We can have those up at the top, with a gradation all the way down to those things that are very physically active for us, where we are moving a lot. Our behavior differs in character, sure, I get that. But I don't think that because you are using the mind for a particular activity that there is a greater ability to show intelligence than that which involves physical activity, or maybe less quote-unquote reflective thinking. So we can still look at that y-axis as describing the behavior or the character of our behavior. But then the x-axis, if we added that in, maybe we could take a look at the quality of our behavior on that axis. And we could go from, on the left, lower intelligence, lower creativity, lower adaptability, lower innovation, to the right where we're higher on all those things. So we're going from left to right in terms of low quality behavior to high quality behavior. From top to bottom, we're going from more sedentary activities to more physically active behaviors. A new reconceptualization of intelligence. Let me give you some silly examples here from one of my heroes, or at least he was until I found out more about his personal life. Michael Jordan, one of the greatest basketball players of all time, would be on the bottom left when he's playing basketball. He showed a great deal of intelligence playing basketball, right? Creative, he was creative, he was adaptable, he was innovative, all of these things that would be trademarks of intelligence. So is Michael Jordan an intelligent person? He showed a great deal of quality of behavior as a basketball player, didn't he? Baseball on the bottom right, baseball is also a physical activity or a physically active behavior. He showed less intelligence there, so he would be farther to the left. Maybe not all the way down to the bottom left corner, farther left. The top right is Michael Jordan with the first pair of Air Jordan shoes. Still a little bit disappointed that Mom didn't buy them for him. He has shown a great deal of creativity, adaptability, innovation in fashion design. His clothesline has become very, very successful, very profitable. This is a more sedentary activity, and he's showing a great deal of quality in that behavior. So that would be upper right. And then upper left, Michael Jordan has had some problems when he enters casinos, and we'll say it has to do with his mathematics, maybe his ability to quantify the odds. He has lost a great deal of money, so he's not showing a great quality of behavior there in a sedentary activity. So it's still up because it's sedentary, but farther to the left. So what does this matter for us? Why should we be talking about this? Well, I would say at a liberal arts institution should be in the business of pushing students to the right. Not the political right, the right, as opposed to pushing students up to more intellectual, to more cranial type things. We should be in the business of pushing students over to the right. Are we doing that? Well, hope has a core value to foster development of the whole person. The intellectual person, the spiritual, the social, and the physical. I think this is a great basis for us to take a look at our gen ed requirements and how well we're doing with this reconceptualization of intelligence. So here are our gen ed requirements, things that we require all of our students to take. Now, if we put those on that y-axis, the way in which character differs, the character of behavior differs from more sedentary at the top to more physically active at the bottom. I've tried to show sort of a darker red up top going down to a lighter pink down at the bottom. I don't want you to hold me to the fire for the specifics of some of where I've listed these things, but I wanted to list it in this way to take a look at within our. We test students. We expect students to learn in a number of different behaviors in terms of character. Religious studies, culture, heritage being more sedentary, more having to do with the mind, and especially FA2 in the arts and health dynamics, with the body are doing things, right? Creating things. Natural science lab is about skill work, most of them at least. Second language and English 113, I have those kind of in the middle because you are doing things, right? You're actually writing or at least typing and you're speaking, so there is some doing there, but I think a large part of the grade for some of that is based on the thought that goes into the speaking or the typing or the writing. Senior Sem and FYS I put them in the middle with question marks. I think each section of those classes differs in character, so I wasn't sure exactly where to put those in. But you can see we have a nice gradation from more sedentary to more physically active in terms of what we're doing. Now I want to draw on some thinking from Kelvin professor of philosophy, James K.A. Smith, a phenomenologist, also I would say a scholar of Christian education. We read a chapter of his in the continuing program. I've read quite a bit more since then. And he talks about the real value in Christian education as being when we see it as formative rather than informative. This is kind of a key phrase that he uses that might help us understand what we're doing and how we're doing what we're doing. Smith says humans are desiring creatures and liturgical animals, that we live first and foremost, we live most primally from the desires of our hearts rather than from what our minds know and hear and then live out. This is a very non-dualistic, holistic type of idea. And we are liturgical animals, that we live from and through the traditions and the habits that we've learned, that we've been a part of in our experiences. Smith says being a disciple of Jesus is not primarily a matter of getting the right ideas, doctrines, and beliefs into your head in order to guarantee proper behavior. It's a matter of being the kind of person who loves rightly. Smith also says the liturgy is a pedagogy that trains us as disciples precisely by putting our bodies, that is us, through a regimen of repeated practices that get hold of our heart and aim our love toward the kingdom. Now, Smith has written a lot on this type of idea based on Christian education, and these are just a couple snippets. But I think it helps us to understand maybe how we can appreciate the gradation of behavior character that we expect and that we have within our general education requirements. So if we look at education, Christian education, especially in a liberal arts institution, as being formative first and foremost as opposed to informative, I think we can sort of re-emphasize the value of the differing behaviors in all of these classes, that we have this gradation. That's a wonderful thing for us. That it's good those classes that are dealing more with thinking, more with sedentary type activities. But also, it's so good that we have these classes that involve doing. It's so good that we have health dynamics. And I think we should be ashamed of ourselves if we fall into the dualistic information trap. When we look at things dualistically, and health dynamics specifically, there would be sort of a tendency for us to say, well, we can get on par with the other general ed classes if we let's give the students more information. Yes, because other classes do tests and they do writing assignments and they do all of these things that have to do with sort of mental knowledge. I think if we fall into that trap, we're doing a disservice to the formation of our students. The value of health dynamics. Yes, we do give tests. We do some things in a classroom 1 day a week out of 3. The value, though, is in the doing the physical activity, becoming physically educated and becoming healthy through physical activity. We do some of the mental stuff. We do some of the in-class stuff. But we certainly want to have the students experience what it's like to be physically active. Experience the difficulties, experience the pains, but experience also the triumphs after a semester of physical activity. How it feels, what it's like. This is the liturgy as pedagogy that Smith talks about. I think we have colleagues in the arts that would say the exact same thing. The value of the FA2 class is not that you're learning about the piano or learning about photography. You're doing it. You're experiencing it. You're becoming a more well-rounded individual. You're becoming someone who has hobbies and wonderful things to do in your leisure time. That can lead to a better life. And I have highlighted in the middle Senior Sem and FYS as being classes that are specifically focused on a student's personal formation. I love that about those classes. I love teaching those classes because of that. It seems to me that fits sort of throughout that gradation. If we're looking at formation as being sort of the hallmark of a Christian education, those fit perfectly right there. And all these classes can be formative for us. A couple of deductions here then to sort of pull together what we've been talking about. The PreFinal Deduction. Dualistic thinking continues to exist. If dualism separates the mind and the body, the mind is valued over the body in academia. And if kinesiology and relatedly, dance, movement, theater, and art deal with the body and movement, then it follows that kinesiology and its peers are relegated to second-class status. Final deduction. But if academia dismisses value hierarchies connected to dualistic thinking, if it's understood that behavior differs in both character and quality, no matter the discipline, and for our embodied nature means that we learn best by doing, repetition, by habits that help aim and also take direction from our hearts, then it follows that a high-quality education aims at student formation using a wide variety of behaviors and experiences. So I've argued today. Finally, it follows that all subjects, disciplines, and majors are on equal footing. This is what we want in kinesiology, right? This is all we're asking for. And it follows that all subjects, disciplines, and majors should not apologize for promoting the habituation of their behaviors rather than falling into dualism's information trap. So that's what I've been arguing today, and I think the whole college does a great job of this. And so this is sort of maybe reaffirmation that we should not fall into the information trap, but instead continue to follow this core value of fostering development of the whole person. This shows low intelligence for me in terms of artistic and digital imaging. Thank you to Karen, to Jonathan, and Andy. We have a few minutes for Q&A, Jonathan?
Certainly. I'm sure Dr. Carlson will love to take your questions. If you don't have them, then I'll start asking questions.
So, in your presentation as a whole, you talked about dualistic thinking as the enemy. But it seems like there were several ideas packaged into dualistic thinking, and those came out in your final 2 slides. There's a metaphysical claim, there's a value claim, and there are some other subordinate claims related to the metaphysical one. I'm wondering if you think, to get the progress you're talking about, we actually need to take a metaphysical position at all. I noticed that didn't feature on your final deduction slide. Could we still be metaphysically dualists, but reject the value claim and get all the progress you're hoping for?
Yes, this is yeah. John, I gotta say, I got a little bit nervous when I saw that you were in the room. I knew I was gonna give you a good question.
I'm sorry.
The guy is writing his dissertation right now on metaphysics. I would say that the answer to the question, if you're looking for a yes or no, dualistic definitely answer. The basis of all this is on the value. I think you've identified that. I want that to be clear. I think the value comes naturally from it. Does it have to be that way? I'm not sure. The way that I teach my students is such that I believe that there's a better understanding of the person, a healthy understanding of the person. So I would say my area of expertise is in thinking about the person not as a combination of mind and body, how that helps in terms of how we treat patients, students, clients, whoever else it might be, kinesiology-related professions. In terms of the academy, can we have the progress that I'm hoping for while still being metaphysically dualistic? I would say possibly, if we can fit that in with the idea of formation that I think is so special about what Jamie Smith writes, that we're getting sort of that we're not trying to change or affect or alter students' worldviews. We are trying to form them or help them form us and help us form them into creatures that into people who are promoting the kingdom's work. That being the hallmark of Christian education. So stop. Yeah. Thanks for the question. Yeah.
Just following up to that, you had those Bible verses on the screen and you were talking about how they're often read in a metaphysically dualist way. I think it seemed like you were doing that sort of cautiously with some recognition that there are other ways of interpreting those very passages, and that this is a matter of controversy in the interpretation of Scripture and in Christian theology's relationship with the history of reflection on metaphysics. And I'm just wondering in there if there are some resources that have been particularly helpful to you or that you would recommend as ways of starting to change value and maybe even change the underlying metaphysics that are driving their thinking.
Right. Yes, I did say that. I did use those verses cautiously. Thank you for if you caught that. The problem lies, I think, not with what Scripture tells us, but in the ways we interpret it. When we see flesh, we immediately think body. We see spirit, we immediately think mind. Whether or not we believe that those are perfect correlators. And I think that since so much of who we are today has been influenced by the translations of Scripture, I think that plays a part in the dualistic tendencies of our thinking. But I would say there's certainly some very helpful things, and I would point to right away what's the greatest commandment? To love the Lord your God and to love your neighbor as yourself, as being something that goes along with sort of the formative stuff that James talks about. Further, I think there's a lot of examples of Jesus sort of getting beyond dualism too. Should we give this money to Caesar or to God? The answer is sort of not. He's fallen into that trap, right? It's give Caesar what Caesar's, give to God what's God's. It's sort of, there are a number of times in which they try, his critics try to trap him in terms of this dualistic thinking, and he's able to get beyond that. He doesn't fall into the trap. Probably known ways of interpreting that too, but the way I see it is, yeah, this would follow the non-dualistic mindset, getting beyond that.
Can I just add that personally, an important stage in my thinking was when I started to take seriously where the creed says, I believe in the resurrection of the body. But what I want to ask about is quite different. We in the West tend to look down on so-called primitive societies, and yet is it not true that the leaders there never encountered the idea of a separation of mind and body? The leaders there are ones who excel in both, and would you care to comment on that?
Can you explain a little bit more of the leaders of?
I would say that tribal chieftains, the great figures in American Indian history, Native American history.
Whether they saw a separation?
Well, it seems to me that our habit of naturally thinking in dualistic terms is one of the less desirable legacies of the rise of rationalism from maybe the 6th century BC on.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. It's been a Western idea, right? It's Descartes' idea for the mind-body dualism. That's the way I learned it. Sort of came along with a period of time where we really seem to value and promote and make great progress in the life of the mind, or the way in which we think about things, the scientific revolution and enlightenment and all these sorts of things came along with all that, which would be which came through these non-primitive cultures, right, as opposed to others that may see less separation, that may see more connection in all things. In fact, there's a lot of specifically non-Western religions that are based on connections. That think specifically of, say, Zen Buddhism, that an interest in being one with one's surroundings and with one's body, which is oneself, and all that. There's not if you have a disconnect, you're not doing it right. So,
Yeah, I'm wondering if maybe there's as much a question of division of labor as there is dualism, and maybe that might not be bad. I teach theology, as you know, and morality, but to this day I can't say that I've made anyone more moral in my class than when they came in. But what I can do is I can give them some habits of mind, some practices, some concepts, and so forth that might provide them with that opportunity. And then when I'm in church, I maybe see even the same student, and we're hoping to develop practices, spiritual practices that might lead them into greater spiritual growth. And when they're in your classes or doing other sports-related things, well, then they're developing that part of their person. And I guess to me that doesn't seem like a bad thing, that we all kind of divide our labor up and do what our specialties can provide. So
yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's a good point. I think that's with a continuum from top to bottom. I think that's what we're getting at with both gen and requirements.
but then the question would be, well, does, for example, Hope need to be also a church or also an athletic club? Or is the specialization, which at least in my related disciplines is, well, yeah, you're basically dealing with ideas.
Right. Yeah. I had a discussion with Jack Mulder, and he said, I think this was an ancient philosophy class he was taking, or teaching. Took the students up to Centennial Park to sort of walk around and be a part of, picking up a pine cone, reflecting on the pine cone. So there's certainly some movement going on there, which is wonderful. And I think, we do certain things that have to do with thinking, not dynamics. So maybe not a rigid separation of labor.
Mhm.
But I see the value that, yeah, absolutely. I think that there's great value in developing all of these skills and trying to push us to the right in all the different pieces. Teaching a religious studies class, a theology and morality class, it's going to be more thinking related. Us in kinesiology, I think we would never say, don't ever move, just stick to your thinking stuff. But as long as we're forming, moving students to the right, I think that's the real value. I do have one beef about the whole general education requirement, maybe the whole general education overall. We allow students to major in music performance, correct? You can major in music performance. You can major in art performance. You can major in theater performance, and dance performance, and you can't major in athletic performance. Thank you for that. I say that a little bit tongue in cheek. Doesn't that seem like
Well,
there are certainly practical reasons for why we don't do that, but
That's not a bad transition to something I wanted to ask you. Another thing that the Department of Kinesiology does here is the athletic program. And from conversations we've had, you've explained to me that that's not necessarily the only way to do it. That there are institutions where athletic programs are different from kinesiology departments. So I wonder if you could talk a bit about this dualism, the mind-body education. You focused on gen ed. Where does athletics fit in? It's a co-curricular, it's an extracurricular. A lot of our students do it, and a lot of them don't, right? And that's completely an optional thing. Whereas when we start talking about gen ed, we can make claims about our institution. We require our students to do the following things. So where does athletics fit into that?
the general education requirements that I chose to talk about today is just one small facet, as we all know, of the whole experience. So I get that, I understand. It's a good point. I want to focus on that because I thought it was a pretty central component of the whole experience. Co-curriculars are also, I think, so valid, so helpful. And so I love my separation of duties right now, that I get to be a part of the students in the classroom, to be a part of what they're doing in co-curricular experiences as well. And I think we have a lot of faculty members on campus who are involved in both of that, which helps to foster development of the whole person, doesn't it? Even if we're teaching intellectually based, or mind-based, sedentary-based classes.
Do the co-curriculars tend to be more body, more skill, more on that side?
Yeah, I think we have a nice gradation there too. Ours are in collegiate athletics because we're being more physically active. But the last thing that we want is for people to say that there's therefore no intelligence going on in our sports. We're not showing we're working on athleticism, not intelligence, as if they're different. I think I had a faculty member's spouse that I was talking to a couple of weeks ago that said we went to a women's basketball game, and it was amazing that the two best students in my spouse's class were also the top scorers in the game. This is amazing that we actually have athletes who are also good students. We're looking at different types of intelligence differences, different behaviors.
It seems like there's, on the one hand, you're kind of wanting to equal out the values and level the playing field, as it were, but still leave room for a gradation or specialization. But that there's also a kind of, you're in some ways suggesting a goal of integrating, bodily activity and intelligence in what we do. And seeing how they in fact reinforce each other, or that there is some sort of something maximally formative in doing them together, like the philosophy example with Jack Mulder, or also going out to the park, and thinking about intelligence in sports. And I'm risking going on a long jag here, but I really like that, and I'm wondering, what at the, in the humanities, say cultural heritage, how could we cultivate doing more of that? But then your idea of majoring in athletic performance kind of pushes in that direction too. What would it mean to make that an athletic subject? You would have to be, you'd suddenly have to start, grading students on their performance based on criteria other than whether they won the game, right? I mean, how would that work? What would that really mean?
I think it'd be very easy to make it work.
Okay.
So when I took my daughter to Vespers just before Christmas, and it seemed to me, and I may be wrong here, I don't know if we have any music comments here, but that most of the students performing in that extracurricular activity, which was chapel choir and symphony, were also music majors or double majors that included music. We don't have that in athletics, right? So our students are all majoring in something that's different from that extracurricular activity. But it'd be very easy for us to figure out how to grade students on something other than wins and losses. We do that quite a bit as coaches.
Right.
We would be doing the same thing that dance department does, or music department does for the performance majors. Some of it's theory based, some of it's skill based.
Right.
Think how that might counter grade inflation. There can be only one MVP.
That's right, only one A, right? That's right. Hard scale for grading.
Well, please join me in thanking Dr. Carlson.